Hey everybody, Professor Jeff here. Today we're going to talk a lot about Plato and some of the ideas that we see coming up in the dialogues that we've been reading for the past 2 weeks. I'm going to introduce you to three important pieces of terminology today that can help you understand Plato as well as some of the philosophers that we're going to read moving forward. The first big piece of terminology is hedonism, or the problem of hedonism as it appears in the allegory of the cave. The second big term that we're going to go over today is Plato's rationalism. Now, rationalism is an epistemological perspective that is distinct from empiricism. We're going to go over both of those terms again a little bit later. You'll have a good understanding of them by the time we're done here. And the third piece of information that we're going over is Plato's theory of the Tri-Partite Soul that he uses to argue for the harmful nature of imitative poetry. All right, let's get to it. All right, so to begin with the problem of hedonism here, just to define briefly, hedonism can be understood as the philosophical position that pleasure is a good thing and pain is a bad thing. Right? So just to put this into the context of our branches of philosophy, right? Let's not forget metaphysics is the branch concerned with the nature of reality. Epistemology is the branch concerned with the quality of our knowledge. And axiology is the branch concerned with making value judgments. Right? So considering that these are value judgments about the nature of pleasure and pain, they fit neatly into the philosophical branch known as axiology. Now, the real question here is how this relates to Plato's allegory of the cave, right? So, in the narrative, we have one prisoner who escapes from the cave. In their escape, they have to adjust their vision from the darkness and the shadows of the cave to the light of the outside world. While they're adjusting to that new light, it's a very painful process, right? It's not comfortable. Their vision needs time to adjust before they're able to recognize the truth of what it is they're seeing. So I think that we can take this point in the story as a good indicator that Plato is in fact not a proponent of hedonism, right? He believes that pain and discomfort to a certain extent can be helpful or useful in helping us grow. And seeking pleasure may actually cause us some problems. Now, this theme will come up a few other times throughout the course of the semester. We will have philosophers who say that pleasure is intrinsically good, right? They would be actual hedonists, where we see with Plato, he's probably not of that position. All right. All right, our second big piece of information here is really a description of a debate that occurs throughout the centuries in the history of philosophy. Now, this is a debate between people who belong to one of two different schools of thought. The first are the rationalists, who believe in rationalism, and the other side are the empiricists, who believe in empiricism. Now, just to very briefly and simply define these two schools of thought, rationalists believe that truth comes from ideas, while empiricists believe that truth comes from the senses. Now again, because we are dealing with concepts of truth in both of these instances, these two schools of thought are very clearly epistemological forms of philosophy. I'm not going to go over our graph again. It's in the graph of the branches of philosophy. It's been mentioned at least twice now. You can go back to the first video and reacquaint yourself with those if necessary. But moving forward, we're going to look at how Plato's theory of the forms actually serves as an instance of rationalist thought, right? So just to, again, very briefly and quickly define Plato's idea of the forms, is that they are ideal versions of qualities, right? So some of the most known examples are beauty, justice, and goodness. And even in the allegory of the cave, he does mention that the prisoner who escapes from the cave discovers the sun, which is the form of goodness. So an understanding of Plato's theory of the forms can really help us to understand a lot of his other arguments that he makes. But for Plato, the forms are the highest version of truth. And since forms are themselves ideas, right? Ideas are the highest form of truth for Plato. Therefore, he is a rationalist. Okay, and we will see moving forward Aristotle, who disagrees with Plato on almost every point possible, is an empiricist. But again, this is really just the first time that we're going to be seeing this kind of idea coming up. And I wanted you to have an understanding of the terminology that is used to describe these different perspectives as we continue studying. Alright, so the last piece of information that I'm going to go over in this video lecture is Plato's theory of the Tripartite Soul. Now, tripartite really just means three parts, okay? So Plato's description of the soul includes the three parts of, the first is the calculating, the second is the desiring, and finally the spirited or emotional part of the soul. Now this description counts as a metaphysical theory because he's trying to describe, right, he's telling us how this thing known as our soul exists. That is a very interesting theory, and it's really persisted for a long time. I like to point out that Freud uses a similar system in his description of the human mind when he lays out the three parts of the id, the ego, and the superego. These can actually be compared to the desiring, emotional, and calculating parts of the soul. This isn't strict course content over here either, but I know some people find psychology and psychoanalysis very interesting, myself included, so I like to point that out. So how this idea relates to the argument that Plato is making in the article on art and imitation can briefly be understood as this right here. Art stimulates our emotions, but the calculating part of the soul should be the one that leads. Therefore, art subverts the system that Plato believes should be occurring in the soul. So art is ultimately harmful to us. And this would fit into the axiological branch of philosophy because he's making a rather harsh, really, value judgment on the nature of art. So just to wrap up, I want to remind you that you should have three really important pieces of information and maybe 4 or 5 pieces of terminology that you now understand and preferably written in your notes. The first of those is the problem of hedonism and how it occurs in the allegory of the cave. You should also have a basic understanding of the difference between rationalism and empiricism, and which side of that Plato falls on and why. And finally, you should also have an understanding of Plato's theory of the Tri-Partite Soul and how that theory factors into his argument that art is ultimately bad for us. Thanks for watching. See you guys next time.